This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that we like to call Israel Behind the Headlines, delving deep into and unpacking issues underlying our lives here in Israel. My guest today is a religions scholar at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specializing in modern Christianity and Christian-Jewish relations. She is the recipient of the Dan David Prize for Historians just now in 2023. And her book, Jacob's Younger Brother, Christian-Jewish Relations After Vatican II, was published last year by Harvard University Press. Dr. Karma Ben-Johanan, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and thank you. It's very good to be here.
So the Second Vatican Council in 1965 was a watershed in Christian-Jewish relations and in effect is the departure point for your study. Can you explain what it was and why it was so important?
Yes, so the Second Vatican Council, some people call it the most important religion or religious event in the 20th century. And this is a moment in which the Catholic world brings together bishops from all over the world and reconsiders many issues. So from the language of liturgy to reading and studying scripture. So really a great variety of topics. And there is one specific declaration. And in this declaration, there is one specific paragraph that is dedicated to Jews and Judaism. This is Declaration on the Church's relation to non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate. And the fourth paragraph is dedicated to the Church's relation with the Jews. And this was really a very dramatic event because this is the moment in which the Catholic institution, so one of the most powerful religious institutions in the world, is actually paving a new path in Jewish-Christian relations and revisiting most of the very sensitive topics that stood in between Jews and Christians for several centuries.
That made these two religions effectively mutually antagonistic.
Absolutely, exactly.
Can you unpack some of these issues?
Yes, sure. So first of all, there is, of course, a question, why should the church even tackle these issues? And this, for me, was actually a very central question when I started studying the topic. And in the background, we have, of course, the Holocaust, and its impact is especially in Europe, but also worldwide. And this kind, in a certain sense, this pushes Christians to think about their part in the history of anti-Semitism, in the fact that the Holocaust is occurring especially in Europe, particularly in Europe and not in other places. So there is this reconsideration and also some criticism about the church's behavior in World War II is already beginning. And then they start. So the bishops are formulating this paragraph, and the theological issues that are tackled there are several. I think one of the most interesting things there, and the most what is considered to be the most important, is that they reject the accusation of the Deicide charge. That is that the Jewish people are responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. So all of the generations, for all generations. There is also a rejection of anti-Semitism. And there are also very interesting notions that say that it's not. So the spirit of Scripture does not condemn the entire Jewish people. Something that kind of hints that the idea that the Jews are no longer the chosen people should be reconsidered.
So would you say that it's, in a way, an implicit recognition of the role of the Christian church in creating anti-Semitism and persecution of the Jews that culminated in the Holocaust, but not only?
I wouldn't say that because in the Second Vatican Council, but also generally, this topic is still debated. So there are various approaches, various Christian approaches to the question of the responsibility, and you see that also contemporary declarations about the issue really try to navigate between extremes or between different poles. Some take more responsibility and some less. And very interestingly, in Nostra Aetate, there is no mention of the Holocaust. By the way, there is no mention of the State of Israel either, even though these events, so the foundation of the State of Israel and the Holocaust, are very clearly in the back of the declaration, and also during the conversations at the council, they are very prominent, but they don't appear in the text. Later on, so during the decades that follow Nostra Aetate, and the book is actually much more about these decades than about the declaration itself, there is more and more grappling with the question of responsibility, with the question of guilt, whether anti-Semitism is rooted within Christianity, in the New Testament even. So some would say that, even though this is a very radical statement and it's not the official position of the church, of course, but there are various perspectives on that. And in 1998, we have also a document that really let's say, attacks these questions much more directly in terms of the question of responsibility. But this still doesn't appear in the 60s.
So what was really the background to the convention of the Second Vatican Council? Was it just the need to modernize in the second half of the 20th century?
So that's a good question. And also, why are the Jews important for the modernization of the church, right? This is exactly, as I started, these are exactly the questions that come into mind. So it seems so natural for us that there are all these guilt feelings in the Christian world. But why should it be natural? They weren't Nazis, right? Even the Protestants, it's easier to think because part of the Protestant church in Germany was really identified with Nazism. But the Catholic Church wasn't identified with Nazism and also not with communism, right? So they are somehow in a safe place, so to say. So why should they approach that? And part of what I am trying to show in the book is that indeed the place of the Jews in this process of modernization is very important, because the Jews are there when Catholics think about how to read scripture. They are there when Catholics think about ecumenism, how to approach other Christian communities, because they were the first community from which the church, so to say, broke off. So they are there, and they are there, of course, when speaking about religious freedom, etc. So they are there in various points. And maybe I will say one more thing about that. To me, this meant, and I think that one of the most interesting discoveries on my end, what I think is central, is that even if we're talking about a relationship, we are still also talking about the Jews as a category that resides within Catholic theology. So there is a sort of a difference between the Jews outside in the world, with which contemporary Catholics are very much willing to start a dialogue, but the Jews and the relationship with the Jews is also important on very different grounds, because Judaism and Jews are also theological categories. What other scholars, such as David Nirenberg, would think, for example, as figures of thought, as rhetorical devices. So as ideas that also help Catholics redefine Catholicism.
Well, any of these ideas, and this is the last question I'm going to ask you about before Vatican II. I know the book is about what came after, but were any of these ideas percolating within Catholic circles before Vatican II about the Jews?
Yes, absolutely. So Vatican II brings together issues that were already there, even a little before the war, and of course during World War II. So you have Catholic figures, Catholic theologians such as Jacques Maritain, for example, that already writes about anti-Semitism, about ideas that actually anti-Semitism is anti-Christian, that the Holocaust or the epitome of anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews should be understood as creating some kind of an affinity between the Jews and the suffering Messiah. So this would mean that Jews should no longer, like they used to be depicted in Catholic theology for a long time, they should no longer be considered as the murderers of Christ, but actually as his kin, as those who somehow are very close to him in terms of their suffering. So we see a transition, or some kind of a typological transition in the way that the Jews are perceived, and the actors in Europe are now, let's say, they're juxtaposed differently by Catholic thinkers. But this is still a very small thing, and it bursts into existence at the Second Vatican Council because the Pope, John the 23rd, it was very important for him. He was also involved in rescuing Jews during the war. And so he's the one that puts it on the council's agenda.
Right. Now, the book is structured out of two parts, the Christian part and the Jewish part. And this brings a question to mind, whether, I mean, the title is Christian-Jewish Relations and not Christian-Jewish Dialogue. And I wonder whether that's on purpose, because you tackle them separately. So was this process autonomous for each of the religions, or was there any crossover in these processes of reevaluating Jewish-Christian relations?
Yeah, thanks. So this is really the heart of the project, this question. And of course, it's on purpose because to a great extent, the book is trying to problematize the concept of dialogue and the idea that we have of dialogue, which does not mean that dialogue is non-existent and that it's not important and that it does not do very fruitful things. And indeed, this is something that we didn't know from previous times in our history. But my idea was indeed that dialogue is kind of a tip of an iceberg, or two icebergs actually, that meet together on the surface. But actually, when you dig deeper, you see that each community has also its own discourse on the other. And this discourse behaves very differently and can sometimes be very wild. And it's hard to, so to say, reconcile between what we see in the internal discourse of Catholics separately and of Orthodox Jews separately, with what happens in dialogue between representatives when, the other is listening. So things look differently when the other is listening and when the other is not. So the whole idea is that when we think about dialogue, what does it mean? Who sets the terms for dialogue? Are the sides even? Are they equal in terms of the standing in dialogue, even though we're talking about a smaller Jewish community and a much larger Catholic community? What exactly, who decides which language should be spoken in this dialogue if Jews speak in the halakha language while Catholics speak in theological language? It's not even the same religious language, the same religious reasoning. So how is dialogue possible?
But still, the departure point here was Vatican II. That was essentially a Christian event. And so what were really the shockwaves that it sent within Orthodox Judaism? Was it, Nostra Aetate, the re-evaluation of the role of Jews in Christian theology, was it perceived as a gesture that was answered by the Jewish Orthodoxy? Or was it just, yet another event on the agenda, regardless of, a process that was already undergoing?
So, first of all, we may say that the Jewish world had different reasons to think about Christians and not necessarily only this reaching out of the Christian community. For example, the foundation of the State of Israel that really changed a Jewish majority in a Jewish state. This is something that is totally weird in terms of the political theological entanglements of Jews and Christians throughout the centuries. So this already puts the challenge on the shoulders of the Jewish community in terms of rethinking about their others. So that would be one thing. Also secularization and extensive religious freedom, rights that Jews did not enjoy before the war in various places. So first of all, maybe thinking about the Second Vatican Council as an event that causes things in both communities in the same way is already, it's not symmetrical, right? Jews have their own their own issues, and these issues are also connected with how they perceive Christians. So this is one point. In terms of the Second Vatican Council, so it took a very long time before the Jewish Orthodox community was even aware that something like this has happened, and also not all over the world. So not all the Jewish Orthodox community is aware still today of this religious event and of the change that occurred within the Catholic Church in terms of its relation to Jews and Judaism. Because we're talking about a very close community, in at least several parts of the world and parts of the community, so they're not very much aware of processes that are taking place outside. And also they have their own problems with knowing things about Christianity, so they are distancing themselves from the Christian world also on purpose, and therefore they are not able sometimes to become aware of these processes. But even those who were aware of that, for better and perhaps worse reasons, for various reasons, sometimes they were very suspicious with regards to the authenticity of this declaration, what it actually means. Is it only an apologetic attempt to appease the whole world and to show a more pleasant and a more liberal face, while actually behind this mask there is the same agenda, the same willingness to actually convert the Jews? Is it a missionary project that is only covering itself in new colors? What exactly is going on there? So it took a long time. And this is actually true not only for the Orthodox world. We see how much time it took, for example, for the first Jewish Declaration on Christians and Christianity, which came out in the year 2000 and wasn't Orthodox at all. So for the Orthodox community, it took even longer.
Right. Much of the time that you review in the book, and that has passed since the Second Vatican Council, was under the leadership of Pope John Paul II, who was in office between 1978 and until his death in 2005. To what extent was it really shaped by his personality, his leadership skills, but also his theological vision?
So I think it was very much shaped by his leadership. I think he really changed the root of Jewish-Christian dialogue, Jewish-Christian relations. This is what I try to show in the book. I would today perhaps formulate it a bit differently after accepting some important critique from other scholars. But so I will try to formulate what I think about this today. When we think about Vatican II and the years that followed Vatican II, we have the beginning of the reception of the Council as a whole, and a very strong debate that is still prominent and in the Catholic world today about the right interpretation. The hermeneutics of the Council is taking place, and you see Catholics trying to push to different directions in terms of how to understand the Council, how to continue the Council's project. And therefore, the theological discourse also on Jews and Judaism is it's a heated debate. It's very strong, and many important theologians are engaged in this during the immediate aftermath of the Council. And then when John Paul II becomes Pope in 1978, he's, of course, a more conservative Pope. These words are not always helpful, but I will just use them for the sake of the argument. So, and he wants to, he also introduces, or he wants to implement a specific kind of hermeneutic of the council, and not to radicalize it, and to implement the changes in other areas that weren't tackled during the council itself. So he wants to tame down the theological discourse, and we see it in various areas that do not relate to Jewish-Christian relations. But in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, this Pope is considered the most progressive Pope ever, right? We think about his visit to the Western Wall, putting a note into the cracks of the wall, his visit to Yad Vashem, his visit to the synagogue, the great synagogue of Rome. So he's doing these gestures, which...
Is that progressive in and of itself? I mean, it doesn't have to be to cede any theological ground. Do you see what I mean?
Good question. Yeah. So perhaps progressive is not a good word,
okay,
right?
Right.
What we can say is that it's totally new, and it's amazing, and it has an amazing effect on both Christians and Jews. So Jews are much more aware of these things, and they see these photos, then they are, reading the little letters of Nostra Aetate. So there is something there that becomes very, very public. It's very emotional. It's performative, right? It's very strong.
So basically, his personality served here to mitigate some of these concerns that were made by Orthodox Jews that you mentioned earlier, right after Vatican II, to say, okay, the Catholic Church is now saying all these things in good faith.
I think he's doing work on so many levels and in so many discourses together. So first of all, the Jewish community is not very attuned to theological considerations and articulations of Catholics, but these sort of gestures are they have this, they create faith, they create trust between the communities much more. But this also allows him not to approve the more radicalized theological perceptions of Jews and Judaism, for example, that will say that Jews do not need Christ in order to be saved. He doesn't go there, and this is sometimes what Jews that are active in Jewish-Christian dialogue would want. So it also allows him to somehow circumvent the deep theological questions that are open there, and present something that is this performative approach allows him to push forward the dialogue very strongly, but without falling into the traps of theological argumentation. So in the book, I didn't exactly present his approach as theological, and today I think that it's more precise to say that it's performative theology that does something different from theological argument that are very clear.
Okay, we've got to explain that what it means exactly, performative theology. And I'm not exactly clear how it's different from your earlier approach to the separation between performance and theology. And now they're sort of, in your new understanding, they're sort of bound together?
No, it's not bound together. I still think that he speaks in two languages. One would be this conservative Catholic theological approach, especially in terms of the universality of the Christian message. And on the other hand, that he presents his reforms on a realm that is not argumentative. It's not about words and how you arrange them. It's not about statements it's something else. It's something that has to do much more with experience. It has this liturgical twist as well, putting a note to the Western world. It's a very religiously saturated gesture, right? It's not only a symbol in the empty sense of the world. So I do think it's of the word. It's saturated in terms of its religious meanings, but you can take it to many directions, and it can sit well with conservative sensibilities and also with liberal sensitivities. So it speaks in all languages, and this is its power, but it's also not always committed to a specific argumentation line.
Right. I want to ask you a couple of methodological questions. One thing about the Catholic Church is that it's, as it should be, single and hierarchical, and there's just one source to consult when you want to study the Catholic Church, as opposed to Orthodox Judaism that is famously anything but single, and well, it is hierarchical to an extent, but not in the same way. So, what can you really tell us about the different realms of Judaism that you studied, how you chose to focus on them specifically, and how they differ from each other?
Great. So even before we talk about the sources and the methodology, even this idea of putting these communities together, what exactly makes it reasonable to put them together? It's already a question, right? Because we're talking about two so different worlds. So why compare them exactly?
So Orthodoxy, just to say, if I'm not mistaken, there's religious Zionism, right? There's these Orthodox state establishment of the State of Israel, right?
The Chief Rabbinate.
The Chief Rabbinate, and ultra-Orthodox.
So it's divided more. There is a halachic discourse that combines various centers. So you have Haredi halacha, and the Haredi halacha would also be Ashkenazi and Sephardi poskim, and you have religious Zionism that is involved in this halachic discourse, but also modern Orthodox circles, Zionists and anti-Zionists. So the halachic discourse is a wide spectrum, and many authorities and Talmidei Chachamim and rabbis can be and are put together in this discourse in the book. So there is a halachic chapter, basically. Mm-hmm. And then there is a very specific, which is a very different chapter, focuses on a specific group within religious Zionism, which we would call in Hebrew the Chardalim or Yeshivot HaKav, those who are affiliated with the Kook school, both rabbis, Kook, the son and the father. Because there you have a very interesting and vibrant theological discourse that you don't find in any other Jewish Orthodox milieu. So that's why there is a whole chapter dedicated to a relatively small group, even though today we see that it gains a lot of power. Small
but powerful, yes.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and then there is another group that there is a chapter that is dedicated to them specifically, and this is the modern Orthodox community in the United States, because somehow they are very special in terms of how they relate to Jewish-Christian dialogue. It's really an issue there that you don't see it as much as an issue in other Orthodox groups. So this is how it's divided, more or less. But I would dare to say that also the Catholic spectrum is much wider than we imagine when we think only about the hierarchical aspect of the Catholic Church, because you have also these independent theologians that can fight against each other and get into very strong arguments. So even though they have the same authoritative texts, it doesn't mean that they approach them in a similar way, and they also have, so it's a very diverse world as well. So the decision was to take these two very different, these different worlds, and to combine the official sources and also the dialogical sources, because there are also documents that are produced together sometimes by representatives of the two communities. And you have, so in the Catholic case, there are the pontifical documents, so those who really have authority, the authority of the church behind them. And by the way, sometimes there are also contradictions between different offices or committees in the Curia. So even within the Vatican, you find documents that do not coincide in terms of their arguments, which is fascinating. And then there are also those independent theologians that can be conservative, they can be progressive, they can be all kinds of, and they can approach these questions very, very differently. And the same goes for the Jewish world. So you have these halakha, these piskei halakha, the halachic rulings, and the theology, and the documents that are supposed to represent the Jewish side in Jewish-Christian dialogue. And what is very interesting is to see the tensions between all of these documents. So within each community, there are so many tensions with regards to the other religion. So if you take all these tensions and then you bring the communities together, you see how impossible the whole project is.
Why was the Cookian current in Judaism so fascinated with? Why did it stand out?
Yeah, wow, this is a very important, very relevant questions for our time as well. So, interestingly, for Rabbi Kook, Avraham Yitzchak Kook, this plays a central role in terms of how he understands secularism. Right? We all in Israel, we are well aware of the fact whether it's instrumental or not, but we know that he had a positive attitude towards secularists and secularism, and that somehow this is supposed to heal Judaism. What is really fascinating, and this is something that I really discovered through reading Kook, is that actually Christianity is very important there, because it's not healing Judaism from some kind of a universal religious tendency. It's really healing Judaism from Christian influence. So this is what secularization is supposed to bring, to heal Judaism from this Christian influence that contaminated it, so to say, during diasporic times, right? During exile. Jewish diaspora, they were so close to the Christian community, and they became somehow Christian themselves in terms of the denial of the body, the denial of the importance of the land of Israel as a very concrete commitment and relationship. So in terms of implementing the Jewish truth within this world and not only hoping for some kind of an abstract salvation. So he's very Nietzschean on this point. He really adopts the anti-Christian Nietzschean critique, which is fascinating in itself. And then the son, Kook the son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda, he's even more, let's say, caustic in his approach to Christianity. And what he thinks, and again, very relevant for our days, is that the Jewish state, that Jewish sovereignty is exactly the place where we should part ways with this Christian influence, right? So we should, a Jewish that is, something that is authentically Jewish has to be somehow non-Christian, or to show that it departs from Christianity and from Christian influence. So everything that is considered to be bad in Western tradition is connected in the Kookist school to Christianity. It's a Christian influence. Liberalism is a kind of an outcome of Christian egalitarianism, and it goes against the election of Israel. So this is very, very central. Until this day, we see how many books are written about Christianity in these. Of course, they have nothing to do with Christianity.
No, of course. No, but this is exactly the point, that, it was just a reformulation of this age-old antagonism that Jewish theologians harbored for Christianity. In a way, everything that happened on the Christian side did not change anything. I mean, certainly not for the better.
Well, my argument in the book is that it's actually a huge change. It's not a new take on old antagonism. It's a whole new antagonism.
Okay.
That really has to do with secularization, with Zionism, with the foundation of the state of Israel, with Nietzsche, right? So it's really something new. Of course, it works with old sources. This is how religions always do that. But it's actually new. So when we expect that modernity will bring only this dialogical turn and reconciliation and peace between religions, we don't consider that somehow these futuristic ideas that we have can take a very different turn, and that modernity can also bring with it new forms of hatred and antagonism and competition, etc.
Right. Okay, Dr. Karma Ben-Johanan, religion scholar at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and author of the newish book, Jacob's Younger Brother, Christian-Jewish Relations After Vatican II. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for the generous support. And now we've got a request because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.